Let me tell you something that most people get completely wrong about American power. They assume that the United States dollar, the global reserve currency, represents the ultimate expression of American dominance. And on the surface, that logic makes total sense. Why wouldn't it? Every day, nations around the world conduct trade in dollars, hold dollar reserves, and price commodities in American currency. It looks like the perfect power arrangement. But here's where it gets interesting. And honestly, this idea flipped my entire understanding of how imperial economics actually works. The dollar is not America's greatest asset. It's becoming America's most dangerous liability. And the mechanism through which this happens is not some external attack or deliberate sabotage. It's the internal logic of the system itself, a trap that tightens with mathematical precision every single day. You know what's fascinating to me? Everyone keeps asking how long American dominance can last. They point to military spending, technological advantage, alliance networks, all the traditional metrics of power. But they're looking at the wrong variable. The real question is not whether America can maintain its military or its innovation base. The real question is whether it can maintain the dollar's role as global reserve currency while simultaneously running the kind of deficits that role enables. Because here's the paradox sitting at the center of the entire system. To remain the global reserve currency, the dollar must be available in massive quantities for international trade and central bank reserves. But to make those dollars available, America must run persistent trade deficits, sending more dollars out than it receives back. Those deficits accumulate as debt, and that debt eventually undermines the very confidence that makes foreign holders willing to keep accepting dollars in the first place. It's a structural contradiction, not a policy choice. And right now, we're watching that contradiction move from theoretical problem to actual crisis in real time. To understand why this matters so profoundly, you have to think about what a reserve currency actually represents at the system level. This is not just about exchange rates or trade convenience. A reserve currency is the foundation of the entire global economic architecture. It determines what gets produced where, who holds leverage in international negotiations, which countries can run deficits without facing immediate consequences, and ultimately, how power itself flows through the international system. When a currency holds reserve status, it creates what economists call exorbitant privilege. The issuing nation can borrow in its own currency, meaning it never faces the kind of balance of payments crises that constrain other countries. It can run deficits indefinitely because foreign holders keep accumulating its currency as reserves. It can impose financial sanctions that cut countries off from the global payment system, and it can essentially export its inflation to the rest of the world. But here's what makes this arrangement fundamentally unstable, and this is the framework that explains everything we're about to examine. The reserve currency system operates through what I call the confidence paradox. To maintain reserve status, the currency must be abundant enough for global use. Abundance requires persistent deficits. Deficits create debt, and debt eventually erodes the confidence that underpins the whole arrangement. The British pound sterling went through this exact cycle between 1914 and 1971. Britain entered World War I as the unquestioned financial center of the world. Sterling was the global reserve currency. London was where international finance happened. But the war required enormous deficit spending. Britain borrowed heavily, diluting the value of sterling. After the war, Britain tried to restore the gold standard at pre-war parity, but the economy couldn't support it. The 1920s saw repeated sterling crises. The 1930s brought devaluation. World War II required even more borrowing. By 1945, Britain was financially exhausted. The United States had become the new creditor, holding massive gold reserves. In 1967, Britain devalued again. In 1971, the last formal ties between sterling and global reserve status dissolved. The entire process took about 60 years from peak to irrelevance. Now come forward to 2025 and look at where America sits in that same cycle. The United States federal debt exceeds $36 trillion. That number is so large it loses meaning. So let me put it in context. Federal debt now represents approximately 124% of GDP, higher than at any point in American history, except the immediate aftermath of World War II. But here's the crucial difference. After World War II, America was the world's creditor, holding most of the global gold supply, running massive trade surpluses, and facing a devastated world desperate for American goods. Today, America is the world's largest debtor, running persistent trade deficits and facing rising competitors with their own manufacturing capacity and technological sophistication. The trajectory is opposite. The deficit spending continues accelerating. In fiscal year 2024, the federal government spent approximately $1 $8 trillion more than it collected in revenue. That's not a one-time emergency. That's the structural baseline. And it's getting worse. The Congressional Budget Office projects that by 2034, annual deficits will exceed $2 trillion, even under optimistic economic assumptions. Interest payments on the existing debt now consume over $880 billion annually, more than the defense budget, more than Medicare, more than anything except Social Security. And those interest payments are growing faster than any other category of federal spending because the debt compounds and interest rates have risen from near zero to over 4%. Here's where the trap mechanism becomes visible. To finance these deficits, the Treasury Department issues bonds. Those bonds get purchased by foreign governments, foreign investors, domestic institutions, and increasingly by the Federal Reserve itself through monetary expansion. Foreign holders currently own about $6 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities. Japan holds about $1 trillion. China holds about $820 billion, despite reducing its holdings significantly over the past decade. Oil-producing nations hold about $350 billion. The European Union collectively holds about $5 trillion. These holders keep buying for one primary reason. They need dollars for international trade, and Treasury securities are how you hold dollars while earning a return. But their willingness to keep accumulating depends entirely on confidence that those dollars will retain value. Think about what happens when that confidence begins to erode, even at the margins. A country like China looks at its $820 billion in Treasury holdings and calculates the opportunity cost. Every dollar held in low-yielding treasuries is a dollar not invested in infrastructure, technology, or alternative currency systems. If China believes the dollar will depreciate over time, either through inflation or deliberate devaluation, the rational move is to reduce exposure. So China slowly sells treasuries and uses the proceeds to buy physical assets, commodities, gold, or to finance Belt and Road projects in currencies other than dollars. That selling pressure pushes treasury prices down and yields up. Higher yields mean the U.S. government pays more to service its debt. Higher debt service means larger deficits. Larger deficits require more borrowing. More borrowing at higher rates accelerates the debt spiral. Other holders see this dynamic and begin their own diversification. The confidence erosion becomes self-reinforcing. Now layer on top of that the question of what America gets in exchange for this mounting debt. In the post-World War II era, deficit spending financed industrial infrastructure, interstate highways, scientific research, education expansion, all investments that generated economic returns exceeding the borrowing cost. Today's deficits finance consumption, transfer payments, interest on past borrowing, and military deployments that don't generate economic returns. The spending is politically locked in through entitlement programs with aging populations and defense commitments across dozens of countries. There is no political constituency for the kind of austerity that would stabilize the debt trajectory. Both major parties have demonstrated willingness to increase spending and cut taxes simultaneously, pushing the problem into the future. Let me walk you through exactly how this plays out at the international level, because the mechanism is actually three separate dynamics running simultaneously. First, there's the trade deficit dimension. America imports far more than it exports, running a goods trade deficit of about $900 billion annually. Those dollars flow overseas to pay for imported goods. Foreign exporters accumulate dollars. In the traditional system, they would use those dollars to buy American goods, balancing trade. But American manufacturing has hollowed out. There isn't enough to buy. So foreign holders park dollars in Treasury securities instead. This works as long as they believe Treasuries are safe and liquid. But it creates enormous dollar accumulation outside American borders, about $12 trillion in foreign hands. That's potential selling pressure if confidence shifts. Second, there's the currency competition dimension. For decades, there was no alternative to the dollar for international settlement. The euro was too fragmented. The yen was too small. The yuan was not convertible. But that's changing with remarkable speed. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, are actively developing alternative payment systems. The mBridge project connects central banks for direct settlement without dollar intermediation. China has established yuan clearing banks in over 100 countries. Russia and China settle bilateral trade entirely outside the dollar system after Western sanctions demonstrated that dollar dependence is a strategic vulnerability. Saudi Arabia, which has priced oil exclusively in dollars since 1974, now accepts yuan for Chinese oil purchases. The United Arab Emirates uses yuan for trade with Asia. These aren't hypothetical future developments. This is happening right now in 2025 and accelerating. Third, there's the weaponization blowback dimension. The United States has used dollar dominance as a coercive tool, freezing assets, blocking transactions, and excluding countries from the SWIFT payment system. This worked when there were no alternatives. But every use of financial sanctions teaches adversaries and even allies that dollar dependence is dangerous. After the U.S. froze Russian central bank reserves in 2022, approximately $300 billion, central banks worldwide began diversifying away from dollar assets. Gold purchases by central banks reached record levels. Alternative reserve currencies like the euro, yuan, and even smaller currencies like the Singapore dollar gained share. The International Monetary Fund reports that the dollar's share of global reserves has declined from about 73% in 2001 to about 58% in 2024. That might not sound dramatic, but the trajectory is consistent and accelerating. Here's another factor that deserves serious attention. The domestic political economy of the United States is fundamentally incompatible with the discipline required to maintain reserve currency status. Britain faced the same problem in the 1960s. To defend sterling's value, Britain needed to run tight monetary policy, constrain government spending, and prioritize external balance over domestic employment. But British voters kept electing governments that promised expanded social programs and full employment. The political system could not deliver the economic policy the currency system required. Eventually, something had to give. The currency gave. Now look at American politics in 2025. There is zero political will for the fiscal consolidation that would stabilize the debt trajectory. Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid are politically untouchable. Defense spending is politically untouchable. Tax increases are political suicide. The only variable that adjusts is the deficit, and it adjusts upward every year, regardless of which party controls government. The Federal Reserve faces an impossible trilemma. It can maintain price stability through tight monetary policy. It can support employment through loose monetary policy, or it can help finance government deficits by purchasing treasuries. It cannot do all three simultaneously. In the 2010s, the Fed chose to support deficit financing through quantitative easing while inflation remained low due to globalization and technology. But inflation returned in 2021 through 2023, forcing rate increases that made deficit financing more expensive. If inflation returns again, the Fed faces a choice: raise rates and push the government toward debt crisis, or keep rates low and let inflation erode dollar purchasing power. Either choice undermines confidence in dollar stability. Stay with me here, because this is where the timeline element becomes crucial. The question is not whether this system becomes unsustainable. The question is when it reaches the inflection point where confidence shifts from slow erosion to rapid collapse. Based on historical parallels and current trajectory analysis, that inflection point likely arrives between 2027 and 2030. Here's why that window matters. Federal debt will cross 140% of GDP by 2028 under current projections. That's the level where sovereign debt crises historically become probable. Interest payments will exceed $2 trillion annually by 2028, consuming about 20% of all federal revenue just to service existing debt. At that point, any economic shock, recession, financial crisis, major war triggers a cascade where deficits explode, borrowing costs spike, and the debt becomes mathematically unmanageable without either default, inflation, or both. Now add to this something that makes the 2027 to 2030 window particularly significant. Several major geopolitical developments are converging in that exact time frame. China's economic transition from export-led growth to domestic consumption will be substantially complete, reducing its need for dollar reserve accumulation. The European Union's fiscal integration, driven by shared defense spending and energy transition costs, will make the euro a more credible alternative reserve currency. India's economy will cross $5 trillion in GDP, making the rupee relevant for regional trade settlement. The BRICS currency initiative, whatever form it ultimately takes, will have moved from concept to operational reality. And most importantly, the generation of global leaders who came of age during unquestioned American dominance will have been replaced by leaders who experience multipolarity as normal. Let me show you how this cascades through the international system, because the effects are not linear, they're exponential. Imagine the moment when treasury auctions begin to struggle. Maybe it's 2028. The government needs to borrow $600 billion in a single quarter to cover deficits and refinance maturing debt. But foreign buyers pull back. Demand is weak. The auction clears, but only at higher yields than expected. Markets notice. Bond prices fall across the entire Treasury curve. Holders who were on the fence about diversification suddenly accelerate their selling. The next auction goes worse. Yields spike. The Federal Reserve faces pressure to intervene and buy treasuries directly to prevent market dysfunction. But that's monetary financing of deficits, exactly what destroys currency credibility. International holders see the Fed monetizing debt and accelerate their exit. The dollar depreciates sharply against other currencies. Import prices surge, inflation returns. The Fed is trapped between defending the currency through rate hikes that would bankrupt the government or defending the government through rate suppression that destroys the currency. This is not some distant theoretical possibility. This is the end game of the confidence paradox that has been building for decades. And here's what makes it particularly unsettling to serious analysts in Washington. There is no policy fix that doesn't require political will that demonstrably does not exist. Fiscal consolidation would require cutting entitlements and defense while raising taxes, political suicide. Inflating away the debt would destroy middle-class savings and trigger international flight from dollar assets. Default would shatter American credibility permanently. Aggressive growth policies might work if they could generate sustained 5% real GDP growth, but the economy hasn't managed that since the 1990s, and structural headwinds, aging demographics, productivity slowdown, debt overhang make it nearly impossible now. The implications start at the tactical level, but rapidly cascade upward. For American military planners, the most immediate implication is that the era of cost-irrelevant force projection ends. Right now, the United States maintains about 750 military installations in over 80 countries. That global presence costs about $150 billion annually beyond the core defense budget. It's sustainable only because America can borrow without limit. When borrowing costs spike and lenders pull back, the Pentagon faces actual budget constraints for the first time in generations. Forward deployed forces get withdrawn. Alliances become transactional. Security guarantees become conditional on allied burden sharing. Adversaries probe the gaps. At the regional level, the implications reshape alliance structures across every contested geography. In East Asia, countries that have relied on American security guarantees since 1945 suddenly face a choice: accommodate Beijing's regional dominance or develop independent deterrence, including nuclear weapons. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, Australia, they all run the same calculation simultaneously. Some will choose accommodation. Others will choose armament. Either path increases regional instability. In the Middle East, the petrodollar system that has structured the region since 1974 unravels. Oil producers price in multiple currencies. They diversify reserves away from dollars. The strategic rationale for American military presence in the Persian Gulf dissolves. Regional powers, Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, compete for influence without American arbitration. In Europe, the security architecture built on NATO and American commitment fragments. If America cannot afford to maintain its conventional force advantage, European nations must either accept greater vulnerability or build independent military capacity. That means fiscal integration to fund defense spending, which accelerates European political centralization, which makes Europe a true peer competitor to the United States rather than a dependent ally. At the global economic level, the transition away from dollar dominance restructures how international trade, finance, and development function. Countries that have been constrained by dollar shortages and debt denominated in currencies they don't control suddenly gain policy autonomy. They can run more expansionary domestic policies without triggering currency crises. But they also lose access to the deep liquid dollar funding markets that have financed development for decades. Global trade becomes more fragmented, with regional currency blocks replacing the unified dollar system. This reduces efficiency but increases resilience. It also reduces American leverage over international institutions like the IMF and World Bank, which have traditionally functioned as extensions of American policy. At the structural level of international order, we're watching the end of the unipolar moment that began in 1991. Not because America chose to step back, not because another power defeated it militarily, but because the economic foundation of American dominance, the dollar system, carried within itself the mechanism of its own obsolescence. The reserve currency privilege that enabled decades of deficits eventually accumulated debts that undermined the confidence that made the privilege possible in the first place. This is the confidence paradox, completing its cycle exactly as it did with British sterling, but compressed into a shorter time frame and at vastly larger scale, because the American system integrated the entire global economy in ways Britain never did. These trends aren't happening in separate boxes, they interact. Reduced military presence makes the dollar less essential for countries seeking security. Reduced dollar dependence makes military presence less affordable. Less affordable presence accelerates alliance erosion. Alliance erosion reduces America's ability to set international rules. Reduced rule-setting power makes the dollar less attractive as a reserve asset. The cycle reinforces itself at every level. So when you zoom all the way out and look at the complete picture, what you see is not some external assault on American power. What you see is a very elegant trap. A trap built not through enemy action, but through the internal logic of the system itself. The dollar's reserve status created the exorbitant privilege. The privilege enabled deficit spending. Deficit spending accumulated unsustainable debt. The debt erodes confidence. Eroding confidence undermines reserve status, and the circle closes. The British took 60 years to complete this cycle. The Americans might complete it in 30, maybe less, because modern financial markets move faster, information travels instantly, and alternatives exist that didn't exist in Britain's era. The real question now is not whether this transition happens. The evidence points in one direction too consistently. The real question is whether it happens as gradual managed decline or sudden disorderly collapse. Gradual decline would mean slowly rising borrowing costs, incremental reduction in military presence, negotiated adjustments to alliance structures, and years of grinding economic stagnation. Sudden collapse would mean a treasury market crisis, emergency Fed intervention, sharp dollar devaluation, rapid inflation, international financial contagion, and geopolitical chaos as every regional power scrambles to fill vacuums simultaneously. Which path we get depends on variables that remain genuinely uncertain. The timing of the next recession, the credibility of alternative reserve currencies, the political decisions of a few key countries, and whether American leadership recognizes the trap early enough to manage the exit. But here's what we can say with considerable confidence. The system as currently structured cannot continue indefinitely. The mathematics don't work. The politics don't align. The international environment has changed. Every year of additional deficit accumulation makes the eventual adjustment more severe. Every use of dollar weaponization accelerates the search for alternatives. Every failure to reform entitlements or constrain military spending tightens the trap further. Empires do not fall overnight. They erode. And right now, the mechanism of erosion is not military defeat or technological obsolescence. It's the currency system that was supposed to be the ultimate expression of dominance, revealing itself as the ultimate vulnerability. The dollar trap is closing. And the interesting question is what the world looks like on the other side. When the reserve currency privilege that structured international relations for 80 years no longer exists, and American power has to operate within the same constraints that bind every other nation on Earth.